Hi, everyone. My name is Metiseli Due. I'm a co-op student working with Chris and Diane at the COVID Resilience Network. Thank you for joining us this week for a discussion with Kim Van Der Woerd, founder of Reciprocal Consulting in 2003. Reciprocal Consulting is an award-winning, all-Indigenous consulting firm specializing in program evaluation. She will be holding a dialogue on the colonial nature of current systems of research and evaluation and how to transform these systems. Our host, as always, is Diane Feingood, professor at the Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue. Thank you for tuning in.
Kim, really great to have you here today, and I look forward to the conversation. Do you want to say anything before I jump into questions?
Sure. Good afternoon. Gilakasla, Nuguam, Glalasiam. I'm sharing the name that my grandmother gave me, Glalasiam, in our family's first potlatch. I'm a member of the Numgis Nation, which is in Alert Bay, BC. But I'm coming to you from the homelands of the Othama people. They were renamed Pima by Spanish settlers, Spanish missionaries. They were renamed Pima because they were talking and the Spanish people couldn't understand them. So they thought it was their right to rename another group of people to something that they could pronounce. So the Pima people were saying, we don't understand, which sounded like Pima. So that's how they are now called that in today's time. So thank you for having me. I'm so grateful for the opportunity and really honored to be here with this group of people to have conversations. And I'll preface by saying I'm not an expert at all on decolonizing the world or anything. And I really am more of a practitioner and not so much a theorist. So there'll be other people who speak much more eloquently about the theory of decolonizing. But I'm excited to share some thoughts about what we've seen in our work, and really also to acknowledge my team at Reciprocal Consulting. We have conversations about this all the time. So everything that I shared today is a little bit of what my ancestors are probably going to kick me to say, and a little bit of what my team and I have talked about over the last while.
Thanks, Kim. Interesting that you're coming from the place where the Pima Nation is, or thank you for explaining that distinction, because when I was a young researcher doing diabetes research, the Pima population is a very studied population when it comes to type 2 diabetes. And I don't have a good sense whether all that study has actually been helpful to the people or been of interest to the people, but that's a conversation. Maybe it's a conversation for this, I don't know. But anyways, it's been, so when I was young, that was a very, that would be community engaged research for basic scientists in diabetes and clinical researchers. Kim, you've started to answer the first question that I offered to you about who do you come from and what aspects of your life journey shape how you approach your work. But I wonder if you might want to dig a little deeper into some of the, so this is my way of asking you to tell us about who you are and what's important to you and the work that you do and where you come from.
Yeah, I'm a member of the Numgis family, and my family there, my birth mother is Edith Shaughnessy and her mother is Dorothy Wannick. I come from the Shaughnessy and Wannick family. But I guess if we're thinking about what informs how I work, I think it's really me being a representation of the Indian Act in many ways. So I'm a product of the 60s scoop, and some of you in the Zoom room may or may not know about that, but that was a time when we had the government and churches took children away from their families. So I'm a product of that. And I am a daughter of an Indian hospital survivor. So I think, and then I was also adopted by the most wonderful Dutch family who have such an influence in how I think and act and everything as well. But I growing up, we always went to marches. We always went to just different justice-oriented issues with the family, and I think just kind of coming into my own of who I am and recognizing that my blood and my ancestors are at the center of my cellular memory and the work that I do, and that informs why I speak up and speak out about a number of different things that I'm seeing. Yeah.
Thanks, Kim. I really appreciate that reflection of the mix that we all are mixes of different things, and they influence the way we think. So I appreciate that. So let's start with that sort of big question. In what ways do you see the systems of research and evaluation, particularly the ones that you work in and that you know well, deeply colonial in nature? And what is it that's kind of reifying this sort of colonial mindset, if you can?
It's just a big question to start out with.
Go wherever you like.
Well, it's such a good question, and I happen to have had a meeting just before we got together today, and I'm kind of riled up about that meeting. We were in the meeting, and the individual was giving us a PowerPoint about their methodology on working with Indigenous youth and families, and said, oh, and at the end, we'll just throw in OCAP principles, which are ownership, control, access, and possession. And it was an afterthought of having Indigenous principles of self-determination as part of the work that they were doing, working with Indigenous communities and families. And I was seething. Like my stomach was upset and my heart was racing, and it wasn't the phone call that they expected, because I ended up like just having to really speak up about that. Like, why are we always last? Why are we an afterthought to fit into your methodology and worldview? I think one of the things as I was pondering, and we had a chance to talk before we came together, you and I, Diane. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is this whole process of renaming. Like I have been introducing the fact that I'm here on Pima Othama lands. And we've had our feet on the soil here, the desert. And I've been thinking about the fact that we have the audacity to rename people and rename things. And that is so emblematic everywhere we look. It's happening. Like I from the Numkis Nation, but the Indian agents renamed us Nimkish. And like Nanaimo, what now people think of as Nanaimo, they were Snuneymuxw people, and you were pronouncing Squamish in the right dialect. And I think there's just a whole history of erasing personhood through doing acts like that, and it's not necessarily research that is leading the forefront of renaming, obviously, but it's there's an anglicized erasure of culture that has happened, and I think when we think, so that's, I've been thinking about that and how that links to research. And I mean, obviously there's not a really clear pathway between it, but I think in some of the conversations I've had this week, we go to, well, axiology and onto ontology, and thinking about all the philosophical underpinnings of the Western worldview. And most research is dominated by a Western worldview, where Indigenous ways come at the very end. And, we're in the realm of evaluation, program evaluation, and it's pretty incessant. Like the whole notion of evaluation is so that we can check up on you. And the notion of accountability is just so different than than other worldviews would have. So it's a complicated question.
So, but maybe I can sort of dig a little bit deeper here. One of the things that I say from a systems point of view is that we need to shift our systems from accountability to learning. That if we could make the mental shift that what we're doing in research and evaluation is about learning, we might measure different things. We might have different structures for doing that. We would be doing it for the people who need the data and engaging with them with the data, which is somewhat foreign, albeit coming maybe a little bit closer to what people do in the academy now. But that shift is a big shift, and I wonder. Well, I'll kind of bring it to another question I had posed for you about Indigenous ways of knowing. Are there ways in which we can embrace Indigenous ways of knowing to help us shift? Because my own sense, what I know of that, is it's more about learning than it is about the kind of traditional colonial accountability. So I wonder if you can reflect on those relationships a bit. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm a tough questioner.
I know. I love that about you. I think I think evaluation, like I'll come from an evaluation perspective. I think it needs an entire paradigm shift, and I've actually been speaking more about how evaluators and the field have actually contributed to the status quo, and that's really troubling. When asked I was participating in a master's thesis study the other day, and when asked to say some wise practices from evaluation, I said, I don't know that I can actually do that now. Like my headspace has been recently thinking, what if we change? Like evaluation has been around for maybe 70 years. 70 or 80 years, and just in concert with research, which research is the opportunity to understand our world and human nature. That gives us a window into understanding. And when we think about the atrocities that have happened in our history, we're not learning, and we're repeating. So we have the whole colonial history with residential schools and Indian hospitals and so forth. And there are many who will say that we're continuing. People will go in for children in care. Indigenous people will go into care. A lot of Indigenous people will go right into the prison system. We can't argue that we've gotten rid of segregation. Like that is everywhere in reserve systems and all of that, and we're perpetuating these atrocities that have happened since then. And if research and evaluation have the gift of being able to understand humanity to make it better, then I just don't think we're going about it right. Because probably everyone has heard about the 17-year lag between research and policy. Like what are we missing here that we have a 17-year lag? So I just don't think we're doing it right. I don't think we're asking the right questions to be able to move the dial. The example that comes to mind is like all the diversity and inclusion efforts that are happening. And Forbes has a really good article on the things that go wrong with diversity and inclusion initiatives and efforts. And this is, to me, an example of how, like it started in the 70s. So we have about 50 years of data and thinking about diversity and inclusion. And a really popular indicator would be, let's look at the race-based income and see what how we did. And the reality is, the race-based income divide is bigger now than it's ever been. So where does evaluation, where does research fit into that, to ask the questions to move that dial? Because the other metrics there continue to not be like BIPOC individuals in these leadership positions, more in the blue collar work. So I don't know that I've answered your question in any way, but yeah, I don't know.
Well, I wonder if we could unpack it a little bit. And one unpacking that I think might be worthwhile is, so do you have a difference in your mind between research evaluation and quality improvement? And I've asked this question to a lot of people because I'm quite curious about it, and suggested that we should blur the lines. But I'm curious about where you sit in that question. Are they different, and what's different about them?
Well, I think that I'm going to come at that from a notion of positionality and just thinking about the teachings that I've had. And it like just in terms of sharing resources and so forth, Linda Smith, Decolonizing Methodologies is kind of a must read for everyone. And she says in her first chapter that no self-respecting Indigenous person would ever be involved in research because of the history that we have with research. And then flash forward, or maybe not back, actually, Marie Baptiste Castellano has said that Indigenous people have been researched to death. It's time to research ourselves back to life. So I don't know, like I have maybe a cynical view of research in sort of an academy perspective, because it's for the purpose of promoting your tenure and or tenure and promotion actually, and there's like the next clever research study and getting grants and so forth. And I know unequivocally that not everyone has that perspective, but they're like it's a matter of life and death for our communities to understand the system, the worlds that we're having to walk in, and literally a matter of life and death. Like right now at St. Paul's Hospital or at Vancouver General Hospital, there's an Indigenous person who's just being mistreated and misdiagnosed. And the Sinclair case in the prairies, it's a matter of life and death. So research, evaluation, I think the textbook definition would say it's for the purpose of improving programs. And then the last one, quality improvement, ideally would be an action-oriented piece at the end of an evaluation where you improve the quality of work. Without going into all the formal descriptions, but just thinking, again, I just am coming at that from a positionality perspective.
It's actually quite helpful. When I wrote about it, well, actually, when I asked Michael Quinn Patton, so should be a guru for somebody who's an evaluator, right, technically, or at least he thinks of himself as a guru. When I asked him this question, he said, research is when you are doing it for everyone and for generalizable knowledge, and evaluations when you have a client. So what's your reaction to that? Is that, I mean, that for me, that just sort of says, what I wrote after that was that I thought research, if it didn't blur those lines a little bit more, would be increasingly unuseful. Like it's not going to be helpful to us. The more we talk about it in that term of generalizable knowledge, when many of the research questions we need to be asking are around complexity, and complex systems and complex challenges are unique, it feels like research will become increasingly irrelevant.
Unless we shift the definitions and swap them out. And his first definition was what again?
Well, research is for generalizable knowledge, and evaluation when you have a client.
Yeah. Maybe we need to switch that definition and have evaluation for generalized knowledge. and research with a client. That might be more appropriate.
Yeah, I don't know, but I just was trying to unpack a little bit some of what you were saying before about research and evaluation, and where racism, where there's systemic racism perpetuated by the system. So for research, it's clear, and a few people have said something in the chat, that this is in part about and you said about the academy and the way the academy functions, and all the sort of notion that we can actually tell the difference between 3.97 and a 3.98 score on a grant, and that one gets everything, one winner takes all, and that it's a function of publications instead of finding ways to value a broader range of approaches and perspectives. So for me, that's very colonial in nature, the way the research system works. But maybe you could say a little bit more about the evaluation system. You and I talked about things like Treasury Board requirements was an example, and how the parameters of program research and how it's funded really reinforce a colonial sort of perspective.
Well, most funding from the public sector, be it provincial or federal, is mandated, and you used the term accountability earlier, is mandated to evaluate, and the Treasury Board oversees it. And there's such a parallel between the scope of inquiry from the Treasury Board as there would be in social science research. And I am an alumni from SFU. I did my degrees in the Department of Psychology, and there's most certainly a parallel with the positivistic paradigm. And I mentioned earlier how evaluation is about, let's check in to make sure our dollars are being spent appropriately, and we're getting the outcomes that we think we need to get. And there's a certain paternalism in that mind frame of operating in that way.
Have you thought about what a system that was decolonized would look like? So what changes might we be looking for in the way the system functions to support learning, as opposed to just accountability? What does that look like? I know from a conversation I had years ago with somebody from the McConnell Family Foundation, they talked about their granting structure and the accountability for their evaluation for accountability had to be separated from their evaluation from learning process, because they really were pushing towards learning, and they had to separate them because of the tensions between them. So I'm trying to push us into that space. How can we envision? What does it look like if we are able to decolonize these systems a bit, at the least? What do those first steps look like, and what does a decolonized system look like?
It's so interesting that they have to exist in parallel to each other. And I remember having a conversation with one of our colleagues in the North, who is running the Indigenous health. I want data that will ensure that everyone shows up to be their best self in their work. And like, what a shift in thinking. So it's not about accountability. It's about what's going to be most helpful in delivering the best services possible. And we struggle with this all the time, thinking about the parallel of accountability and what do you really want to know. And when we work with clients, we do, that's what the theory of change says, that we should be measuring and these outputs and these short-term outcomes and so forth. And so I think, and then we have the conversation of like, no, but what do you really want to know? Like, what's your blue sky in this work? And it's a paradox that we have to juggle both of them, and that we have to invest time in things that they don't want to know about. But the decolonizing, like I think about what information do people need to know to find justice and equity in their work. I think that's really important. Whose voice we're privileging. There's a phenomenal statistician. I adore her. Her name is Heather Krause, and she has a website called We All Count, and they really focus on data equity. We heard her talk, and she talks about how we have a tendency to research down instead of researching up. And if we just think about what that even means in terms of who participates in our studies and how we go about our work. And like, I guess turning that on its head, thinking about who we privilege. If we are privileging individuals that are most targeted to not receive resources in our community, that is an act of decolonizing. Making space for other worldviews is like really important. You talked about, I think we talked about two-eyed seeing, and just like even sitting with the definition of that. So the definition would be that I, come into a particular setting, and I bring my ancestral knowledge, and I bring the teachings of my family and my communities and my sisters at work, and I bring that Indigenous view. But then I also have been trained at SFU, and I bring that view. So I have the two eyes to see a particular instance, and I walk in those two worlds. But for most people, they come in with a Euro-Western worldview, and they have the privilege of not having to have two-eyed seeing. So I think like just even sitting with that notion for a little while and thinking about, wait a minute, there are other worldviews at play. There's other ways to see this, and other ways to value, like that whole axiology question about what is valuable. Yeah, I mean, there's tons written about it, and the whole, I think reading authors like Maggie Kovacs, Sean Wilson, Linda Smith, and Braiding Sweetgrass, that book, there's a lot of really good information about how we can go about decolonizing the systems.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that, Kim. So I want to also invite people in the audience. We have a great group today to offer up some questions. We'll start by asking you to put your questions in the chat, and I'll pose them to Kim while we're still recording. And then as we get closer to 2, I'll stop the recording and invite people to turn their video back on, and we'll move into a kind of a more relaxed space of having a conversation with you. So if you've got some questions, please put them in the chat. So maybe I'll turn to a question about you and how the pandemic's been for you, just to shift gears a little bit and ask you what's brought you joy during the pandemic. I think I personally feel like we need to all share some of our experiences of joy in this time, which can be quite chaotic and challenging for people.
I want to go back to the last question for a minute, because there's
Please.
one thing I wanted to say yet about it's really hard to imagine something outside of a really dominant system. So I really raised my hands up to all of the names that I brought up who are working in that space to think of something outside of the really profoundly dominant and racist system that we're operating in, and to think about the decolonizing process not as a checklist of things that we have to do. It's like deeply personal and a journey for everyone. It's a journey for myself, and I'm not a theorist in this area, but to recognize that, I named a few people to read, but that's not enough. That's like just a starting point. of the points that I said, and to not consider it a checklist.
Well, let me just jump in and thank you for that, and thank you. We will capture those names and put them in our recap. And just, I want to agree with you 100% that whenever I'm talking to people who ask about how to go about this kind of work, my answer is to educate yourself. That's the first thing you have to do, because once you see something, you can't unsee it, and then that helps you on the journey. So. I thank you for that. I appreciate that. Back to you, Kim. Do you want to speak about joy, or do you want to speak about decolonization?
They're one and the same. They're one and the same, because being joyful is one of the greatest acts of resilience and resistance an Indigenous person can do. So they're one and the same. I almost want to do a show and tell, but I probably won't. I have one of the things that have been bringing me joy, flowers. They are so my love language, and just being this summer, we've been able to just be out in like the beautiful lower mainland of Vancouver and seeing that, and that has just filled my heart so much with so much joy. And then really strangely, I have no artistic ability. I've been doing paint by numbers, and I've found that so therapeutic. Like I've just slept better, and it's been really nice. How about you?
The other day I baked a banana bread, and in the morning, and I took it. My wife right now is in the city, and I'm still at our place on Gambier Island with the cat. And so I baked this banana bread, and I took a picture of it and sent it to my wife. Texted it, and she said, "In the 32 years we've been together, you've never baked before." So. And she's not 100% right, because early in the pandemic I baked some peanut butter cookies, but she's mostly right. And I think that certainly, I don't know if that brings me joy, but actually what brings me joy is when I get to look out the window in front of me while I sit here on Gambier Island and see a family of deer right, next to my deck, and just munching away on the grass and stuff like that. That definitely brings me joy. It's better than when the wolves show up subsequently to sniff out the space where the deer have been. So as much as I like the wolves, it's not great for our dog, which is why she's in the city. So, okay, Malcolm, you've got a question. Can we speak about approaches to decolonize community-based participatory research and community engagement, two approaches that have a lot of traction with Western research and evaluation? Do you have any comments on that, Kim?
My first thought is intentionality. And again, this goes back to a conversation we were having earlier about the OCAP principles, and thinking about the intention for doing work. And the example that I gave in my earlier conversation was that was getting me hopping earlier, was that when we do the work that we do, any project that we're working on, it's so rooted in our colonial history and devastation and deleterious outcomes for our families. And no matter what project that we're working on, whether it's women's safety or physical activity or mining or whatever, there's a connection to our history, and there's a connection to justice and equity. So that would be like my first thought about how to decolonize that process, is to think about the reason why that program even exists, to think about the reason why that even exists. Every when we've done training on program evaluation, we start with the word program, and even like just at the nuts and the definition of a program, it's designed to fill a need. So to zoom out and think about what that need is. And I think the heart-based part of it, like just feeling it, like no program is there without a need. Like even Meals on Wheels is there because we've created a society that segregates and isolates seniors, and they're isolated and don't have nutrition. And how awful. How awful is that? And we create a program. So I think intentionality and justice, really thinking about that and why that program is needed.
So you went right where I was thinking to ask my next question, which was how program evaluation is necessarily about a program, but programs sit in context, right? And so I'm curious, when you do your work, how much attention and how much time and energy are you able to give to situating the program in its context and maybe even in its colonial context as you do your work? Like, is that, it doesn't, I'm not an evaluator, so I don't have that expertise. And I'm sure some context setting is important, but do we do enough of that context setting, or do we mostly, as evaluators mostly not do that? And how do you sort of incorporate that into your work, if you can?
We do in every project that we work on, every single project. It's paramount. If we don't think about why that program exists and the context that it's operating in. And I mean, obviously every timeline and budget is different for how deep we can go in that, but it's present in every single project. And I think one of the things our team talks about is the theory, like for people who do evaluation work or evaluation adjacent or whatever, they'll be familiar with the term theory of change. And we've been now calling it the theory of non-change. Sam Saruda on our team named it that, and it's so true. And that goes back to how the beginning of this conversation of me kind of throwing evaluation a little bit under the bus, because what have we done to move the dial? Like the equity issues are still as present now as they were. And yes, of course, there's incremental changes in many different areas, and I don't mean to sound really negative, but I think it's beholden upon all evaluators and all researchers to really think about how we contribute to the status quo. Like that's like, it's not enough now just to do research for the sake of research. There has to be equity at the center of it, and we have to make time for that.
I was in a conversation earlier today in which we were having this kind of recognition of the paradigmatic nature of research, and I think evaluation as well, that you have to fit into a certain paradigm or mental framework, and then you're accepted if you're then following the rules that have been established in those paradigms, right? This was in the context of how do we bring more systems thinking into research. That was the nature of the conversation, but it was paradigmatic. And I think, I guess the question, I'm going to come back at this question, how do we change? How do the paradigms need to change in order to decolonize research and evaluation? I know I've asked this question in other ways, but I'll see if I can stimulate your thinking in a new direction about that problem that I'm struggling with, particularly when it comes to what I call systems thinking. And actually, I came to the conclusion we need to transcend paradigms, as Donella Meadows would say, and stop being so paradigmatic in the way we run our research and evaluation systems. So get out of the paradigm of accountability, or get rid of those paradigms and accept a broader range of things. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, again, I'm not a paradigm expert, but I know, like in my study of psychology, that there have been so many paradigm shifts over time about how we think about how we approach research, and we tend to perseverate in positivism and stay in that space. And I'm not convinced that that's helpful to the social sciences at all. I think we have the opportunity to teach a course at Banff, the Center for Arts and Creativity, and we're teaching it on evaluation frameworks. And what keeps coming to mind for me is We haven't finished prepping all the curriculum and so forth, but what keeps coming to mind is the old ways. And one of the elders that we work with at our SFU course with Elder Roberta Price, she co-teaches with us in the course we teach at SFU on evaluation for transformation. She's said many times, we've been evaluators since the beginning of time. So to think about how the old ways and how did people adjust and live 1,000 years ago before we, like, how did we survive? And one of the things our team has been talking about is like the methodology of visiting, and not the methodology of visiting, but just the notion of visiting, and how we don't do that. Like now, if you think about wanting to see how your wife is doing, you're not going to send her a survey. You're going to have a visit with her. And, if we think about our family, and especially in this crazy Zoom place, we're not sending our families surveys and doing focus groups with them to see how we're doing and how we take care of each other. And I think the paradigm shift, like the learning piece, is one, and we'd like to we'd like to dethrone Michael Quinn Patton a little bit and become the grandmothers of evaluation and talk about how we take care of each other. And that to me is one of the biggest paradigm shifts that we can do.
I love it. And that's great, because my last question was, what will you be doing in the coming months to be kind, be calm, and be safe? So maybe I'll even shift it to what are you going to be doing to help lift others up, or yourself up in that case, as we go through what I think are going to be some deep, dark months of the pandemic in the next 3 months or so.
Well, that almost makes me cry. I think about how our communities are, how we're in service to each other. And I think that's probably what gives me the greatest joy of how to be nice and be calm and take care of each other.
Thank you.